John Mouse Goes to Wormland by Roger Hargreaves. John Mouse was bored. He didn't have anything to do, and that was boring. So he was practicing his hopping in the garden of Apple Tree Cottage, which is where John Mouse lives. Hop, hop, hop. You didn't know that mice like to hop, did you? Well, they do. Hop, hop, hop. Suddenly, from out of nowhere came a voice. "Stop that noise!" John Mouse stopped hopping in mid-hop and looked around. There was nobody there. "That's funny," he thought to himself, and started hopping again. Hop, hop, hop. Then again, from out of nowhere, came that voice again. "Didn't you hear me?" repeated the voice. "I said stop that noise, and I meant stop that noise." John Mouse stopped hopping again and looked around again, and again there was nobody there. "Who said that?" he said. "I did," said the voice, and out of the ground popped a worm, or rather a worm's head. "Oh, I am sorry," John Mouse apologized to the worm. "I didn't know you were under there." "Course I was under here," retorted the worm. "Where else do you think I'd be?" "Yes," said John Mouse, thinking. "Anyway," said the worm, "I'm Ernie Worm. Who are you?" "John," replied John Mouse. "My name's John Mouse." "I can see that," said Ernie Worm. "You wouldn't be John Cat or John Dog or John Hedgehog with ears like you've got, would you?" "No," said John Mouse, thinking. "Anyway," Ernie Worm continued in a rather more friendly manner, "now that you've woken me up, would you like to see where we worms live?" "You just live in the ground," replied John. "In the ground, yes," Ernie Worm retorted, "but not just. Come and see." "How?" asked John Mouse. "Dig," said Ernie Worm. So John Mouse got himself a spade, which was actually an old teaspoon he found lying about, and began to dig and dig. Down and down John Mouse dug. Dig, dig, dig. It was very hard work, and John Mouse felt rather tired. Ernie Worm was no help because worms don't have arms. Suddenly John Mouse's tunnel came into a large sort of a cave which John Mouse fell into. "Follow me," said Ernie Worm, who had travelled through the earth while John Mouse was digging. And Ernie led John down one of the tunnels leading from the sort of cave. Eventually the tunnel led to a door, a bright red wooden door with a spy hole in the middle of it and an eye looking through the hole. "Halt! Who goes there?" said a voice on the other side of the door. "One worm and one friend," replied Ernie. "Enter one worm and one friend," said the voice, and the door swung open. "Welcome to Wormland," announced Ernie. And there it was, Wormland.
"Hello, Ernie,"
said the worm on guard duty.
"I didn't realize it was you."
"I'd no idea worms lived anywhere like this," remarked John Mouse.
"Very few people do,"
replied Ernie.
"They just think we live in the ground."
"Like I thought," smiled John Mouse. They walked along, or rather, John Mouse walked while Ernie crawled. John Mouse had never seen so many worms. They passed a field where two teams were playing football, or rather, headball. They passed a very rich-looking worm smoking a fat cigar.
"That's Sir Roland Worm, the wealthiest worm in Wormland,"
whispered Ernie. They went to town, and on their way they passed a school. The bell had just rung, and all the little boy worms and all the little girl worms were leaving to go home. Eventually they came to the middle of the town. "Does the town have a name?" asked John Mouse.
"Yes,"
replied Ernie.
"Wormingham." "Would you like to see the palace?"
Ernie Worm asked John Mouse. "Oh, yes, please," replied John. And Ernie Worm led the way.
"Perhaps we'll see the king,"
remarked Ernie Worm. And sure enough, coming out of the palace gates in a golden coach, there he was, the King of Wormland himself. What a day John Mouse had in Wormland! Ernie Worm took him everywhere and showed him everything. But eventually, of course, John Mouse had to return to Apple Tree Cottage. "I must be home in time for tea," he told Ernie Worm.
"Right,"
said Ernie.
"I'll take you."
So back they went all the way to John Mouse's tunnel.
"Goodbye, John Mouse,"
said Ernie Worm. "Thank you, Ernie Worm," replied John Mouse, and climbed back up the tunnel he'd dug and popped his head out into the open air of the garden of Apple Tree Cottage. A large bird swooped. "Got you!" he squawked. "Ouch!" squeaked John Mouse, because the bird had got hold of him by his ear. The bird looked down.
"Oh, I say,"
he said, letting go.
"Frightfully sorry, old boy, but I thought you were a jolly old worm, sticking your head out of the jolly old ground like that, what? You haven't seen any worms about by any chance, have you? Because I'm feeling jolly hungry."
"Worms?" replied John Mouse. "No, there are no worms around here." "Pity," said the bird, and flew off. John Mouse scampered inside, pleased that he'd been able to help Ernie Worm. When he arrived inside, the Mouse family were all having tea. Mrs. Mouse was pouring tea from a large teapot. Mr. Mouse was eating a sandwich. Grandpa Mouse was grumbling because the tea wasn't strong enough. And the Mouse twins, Sophie and Amelia, were eating chocolate biscuits and getting into a terrible mess. "Ah, there you are," said Mrs. Mouse. "Where have you been?" "To Wormland," replied John Mouse, "where all the worms live." "Wormland!" laughed Mrs. Mouse.
Really, John, you do talk a lot of nonsense sometimes.
But you know he doesn't, don't you? And that's the end of this John Mouse story. Thank you for listening.